Vermont, the only landlocked New England state. Known for its maple syrup, skiing, and a lack of billboards, a collective 645,000 people call the Green Mountain State home. Nestled in the Winooski River Valley 50 miles south of the Canadian border is the small state capital, Montpelier. Montpelier is the smallest state capital, with some 8,000 folks calling it home. So small, in fact, it doesn't even have a McDonald's. Pre-industrial revolution manufacturing meant that the downtown was built along the banks of the Winooski River, a river which is one of the main watershed outlets for the majority of the Green Mountain Range. Other than a handful of extremely rare occasions, the Winooski River is a lifeline for the city of Montpelier. But on those rare occasions, the Winooski River would put the full power of water on display. Montpelier, and Vermont as a whole, have experienced flooding before. The Great Flood of 1927, Tropical Storm Irene in 2011, and of course the Ice Dam of 1992. But what was to come in mid-July of 2023 was unlike anything Vermont had seen before in its minimal flooding history. Today is July 28th, 2023. It is a Friday, and we are on Interstate 91 North, driving towards Vermont from my native Western Massachusetts roots. I was born and raised here in Western Massachusetts, so Vermont is a special place to me, and I think it's one of the most underrated states in the United States. You know, especially in the fall time and the winter is when that state really shines. But 2.5 weeks ago, Vermont suffered one of its greatest natural disasters in state history. I'm about 24 years old. I turn 24 next month, and I remember Irene vividly. I remember, where I lived in Western Massachusetts, we kind of didn't get the heavy precipitation, but I remember just how impactful the flooding was up there. And then, 12 years later, they're going through a similar type of disaster. And granted, completely different means of receiving the flooding. It wasn't a tropical cyclone that brought the rain this time around. But Vermont is, without a doubt, one of the special places for me. It's a place I spent many weekends of my formative life skiing, vacations, all those types of things. And I felt that it was important to go up there and get an understanding of the scope of the disaster. And the obvious thing is, news cycles, they're gonna constantly jump on the next hot thing, and I don't want this to be forgotten. So speaking of Vermont, here we are now. I've been walking around Montpelier for the past 20 minutes or so, and the first thing that's very obvious is the smell. That mildew type smell, especially walking by a lot of the places that have open doors and stuff. Lots of active work going on right now to try to clear everything out, and the smell. And it's interesting too to see that there's still caked sediments across the road. It looks like along the main street here in downtown, the water was at least chest height based on where the drywall was cut in a lot of these buildings. To better understand the Great Vermont Flood of July 2023,
I need to talk to someone that knows a thing or two about flooding. Jacob Fierstein is an atmospheric science graduate from Cornell University. He is a weather and climate contributor for the Washington Post with a focus in flooding events. Thank you, firstly, for being able to join me today. What are we looking at here in terms of the meteorological impact of this event that took place in July?
Yeah, so this was like a very top end Northeast flood event. It was very top end on paper. The forecast was like absolutely the highest end forecast you can see in the Northeast outside of arguably tropical cyclones. And it also had the impacts of a really high end weather event. Hydrologically. Most of the big flood events in the Northeast are tropical related. This had all of those aspects, but it was not a tropical cyclone. And so it's not unprecedented for stuff like that to happen, but it's really unusual, and I think it made the event even more interesting.
Now, from a hydrological perspective, what allowed this event to be such an impactful event?
That's a really good question, yeah. And I think it calls back to something that I've been thinking about a lot over the last couple of years, which is that really thinking about rain as like 5 inches of rain is 5 inches of rain, whether it falls in Texas or Connecticut, is a fundamentally flawed way of thinking about precipitation. 10 inches in Vermont is more unusual than 10 inches of rain almost anywhere else in the country in a day, for example. And at the same time, an event that is, say, a 500-year rain event or a 100-year rain event is more capable of causing damage in Vermont than it is in most other places, at least in the short time scale. The vulnerability aspect is, as you said, because of the mountainous terrain, in large part, and because of the small, flashy rivers in the mountainous terrain. When you end up with significant rainfall, it very easily can accumulate in these small drainage basins, which can very readily see extensive flooding impacts. You end up with really significant river flash floods, and they may not affect that many people, but they significantly affect the people who do live along the river. And then the recurrence interval side of things is just because it's really difficult to get significant slugs of moisture and heavy rain inland across the Berkshires and across the Adirondacks and across the Catskills into the mountainous terrain of Vermont. And so if you actually look at a recurrence interval map of like what is a 24-hour, 100-year rain event, one of the minima in the Northeast for the lowest amount of rain to reach that threshold is in interior Vermont. And so when you end up with these totals like 6 inches or 8 inches in 2 days, which may not be exceptional in most places, that's enough to be unusual in Vermont, and then that's enough to cause problems.
What sets this apart, would you say, from those other typical flood events that we would see in, the Green Mountains, for example?
I think this was fundamentally a different beast than both a hurricane like Irene or Floyd in '99, which was another big flood event in the Vermont. Tropical cyclones, as I mentioned before, are a little bit more predictable and a little bit easier to communicate. It's much easier to say there's a hurricane coming, guys, watch out, than it is to say there's a multi-day convective, like overrunning stratiform rain event, watch out. And have people actually listen to you. I think Vermont actually is better at listening than most places because they experienced their really bad flood disaster just 11 years ago with Irene. But this was also different from Irene because it was less widespread. Irene caused really significant flooding, as did Floyd, as did the 1927 flood, along relatively significant swaths of coastline, and Vermont was included in those significant swaths. This storm was much more localized, and it just happened that the really extreme rainfall was predominantly focused over Vermont's vulnerable watersheds.
I have one more final question that's kind of zooming the lens back, if you will. And yeah, I'm not sure if this is straying too far, but are we seeing this increase in excessive rainfall events? And is there an inherent correlation to a warming climate? This is obviously a tricky area to kind of talk about it, but every time we see one of these events and the frequency of which, is this something that, we could be seeing more of in the future?
That's a really good question. And yeah, obviously climate's always tricky to talk about, but excessive rainfall and climate change, especially in the Northeast, is one of the more confident areas of meteorology and kind of connecting short-term events with long-term climate variability. And obviously, before I get into all of that, random day-to-day variability that causes weather, that causes flooding, exists in a plane that is, tangential to climate, but it's impossible to say climate change caused something, as you know.
Yeah, for sure.
But that being said, climate change and heavy rain is one of those things where there's a strong theoretical basis for an association. Warming temperatures are exponentially related to a higher ability to hold water vapor. And that means that a same saturated air mass can have more moisture in it, and you can end up with more condensation at a point under efficient process. And yeah, there have actually been observations in line with what is modeled, which is a general increase in mid-latitudinal extreme rain events concentrated towards the tail end of things. So like the worst rain events are more likely to increase, and the result of that is like a 100-year flood event in 2000 will probably be more common to some degree by 2100, for example.
The promising thing to see as well, though, is Vermont Strong. That's their motto. I mean, that's usually like a go-to phrase, but you can tell that everyone's embracing it. There's a lot of people out handing out waters, food banks, lining the streets as well. It's good to see. It's going to be interesting to see how Montpelier rebounds, but also the surrounding communities that are along the river here. And it's not going to be an overnight thing, that's for sure. While it will take time for Montpelier and the other surrounding communities to recover from the flood of July 2023, it's the darkest moments that bring out the best of a community. The folks of Vermont are a resilient bunch, and the communities will come back stronger than ever.